Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I finished reading and wrote a review for recently. I'll say more about that in a minute. It's called A Storm of Images, Iconoclasm and Religious Reformation in the Byzantine World. This is written by Philip Jenkins. Some of you will know my day job. I'm a pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and we have a denominational magazine which features book reviews amongst many other things. And I was asked to write a review for this book. It came out just in 2023, the book did. And so the denomination kindly sent me a copy of the book. I had the chance to read through it and just sent off my written review to the publisher. So that should be coming out in the New Horizons magazine here at some point in the future. I don't know exactly when, but that was limited to just about 500 words. It was very brief. And I wanted to take the chance to do a video review and have a little bit more time and space to interact with this book, because it really is a fascinating book, but it is a book that is about a complicated topic and is itself in some ways a complicated book. It's not as straightforward as saying it's a great book or it's a terrible book or I agree with it or I disagree with it. There's a lot more going on here. So let me try to kind of summarize what this book is about, what it's trying to do, and then I'll interact a little bit with what I saw some of the strengths and weaknesses of it being. So first off, just to orient you to the author, Philip Jenkins is a British author who's been living in teaching and writing in the United States for many, many years now. He teaches at Baylor University, and this is published by Baylor University Press. As a university press book, it very much is an academic work. He's diving into a debate and story that if you are totally unfamiliar with it, you'll probably be a little overwhelmed. As he interacts with it, he does so with a very close familiarity with the scholarship, both primary and secondary sources. There's extensive notes. Unfortunately, this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. They're endnotes instead of being footnotes. I hate endnotes. Just as a rule. And with a book like this especially, where so much of the book, as I'll talk about, is interacting with secondary literature, I really wish they were footnotes so I could see kind of in real time who we're interacting with, who he's drawing from, if he's aware of certain sources, things like that. But anyways, the goods are there. They're just in the back, which creates a little bit of extra work to get at them. But I suppose that qualifies as a first world problem. So what is this book about? Well, as the subtitle says, it's a book about iconoclasm and religious reformation in the Byzantine world. What it's interacting with is really the story of what's come to be known as the iconoclastic controversy, or sometimes it'll be referred to by its Greek name, the iconomachia, the war or struggle over the images. That took place in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, what we often will call the Byzantine Empire. Although, of course, no one in the Byzantine Empire thought of themselves or talked about themselves as being Byzantine. They just thought they were Romans. But it's the Greek-speaking eastern part of the empire in the 8th and 9th centuries. What happened, in a very much summarized nutshell, is that the church had grown to ascendancy, of course, with Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century. The Roman Empire, both east and west, first legalized Christianity and then adopted Christianity as the official religion of the empire. And within a few centuries, or really a few decades, and certainly within the first few centuries, the church and the state, if we want to use kind of our modern categories, became very, very closely entwined. And especially in the East, based in Constantinople there, the emperor became a major figure, not just in politics, as you would expect, but in terms of theology and religion and ecclesiastical disputes as well. And this is at a time where, in the 700s and 800s is kind of the period that we're focusing on. The Western Roman Empire has fallen into decline. The city of Rome has been invaded numerous times. Various tribes and things are kind of vying for control there. And so there is the Pope in Rome is kind of holding together whatever last vestiges there are of a Western Roman identity, but we're quickly moving into what we think of as the Middle Ages. So there's a lot of chaos and confusion going on in the West, and the divisions between East and West have grown sharper, partially just socially and culturally, right? But the differences between East and West, partially linguistically. Latin becomes predominant in the West. Greek remains predominant in the East. And so this is a story that, while it interacts some with the Western world, is primarily an Eastern story. And it's centered really on the Eastern emperors and the bishops and things who are working there in the Eastern Roman Empire, or again, what we would call the Byzantine Empire. And what happened, in essence, as you kind of have that political and social situation unfolding, is that there is an emperor, Leo, who began to take a hard line against the use of images in worship and in worship spaces and things like that, and especially the veneration of images or icons. Now, if you have been in even a Roman Catholic church or many Lutheran or Anglican churches, you'll know that a lot of churches make use of images in their sanctuary, stained glass, statues, things like that. If you've gone into an Eastern Orthodox church and worshiped there, you'll know that icons and images are everywhere, and that they're not just decoration. They're very central to the theology, liturgy, and identity of particularly the Eastern Orthodox Church. And as I said, this is a debate that really springs up in the East. And so you have this Eastern emperor who is beginning to take a hard line against those images. And that sparks a series of kind of back and forth struggles over the question of images. So again, this is the iconoclastic controversy, or the iconomachia, the struggle or war over the images that takes place. And what you have is, on the one hand, you'll have emperors who at certain times are trying to suppress the use of images, sometimes even trying to destroy images, and then the winds of power will shift, someone else will come to the throne, and then all of a sudden the empire swings to support the use of images and to promote their creation and institution in churches and all these kinds of things. There's all sorts of back and forth that goes. People get are exchanging theological treatises, arguing for the virtues of or not having images. There are councils that are called, one very famous council, the Council of Hira, condemns the use of images. A later council, the Second Council of Nicaea, condemns anyone who condemns the use of images. So there's all sorts of back and forth. And as you can kind of tell from the way I'm framing this, because of the structure of things at this time in the history of the church, especially in the East, this story is, part politics, part theology. It's all kind of jumbled together. And it's a very confusing story, both because there's a lot of back and forth that happens, and even just for the layperson, as you're tracking that story, the emperors tend to use the same names. So there's like 3 or 4 Leos who are really important, a couple of Constantines who are really important. So you're always kind of like, who are we talking about right now? It can be very disorienting. But beyond that, the kind of conclusion of this about a century of struggle over the question of, are images right to use in worship or not, was that images were very firmly embraced. They became very central to the identity of Eastern Christianity. And the Second Council of Nicaea, which condemned those who had been against images and said you must embrace and venerate and use images, things like that, that became kind of the official, it became the official stance of the Eastern Church. And that council is also recognized by the Roman Catholic Church, things like that. So it's had a huge impact. And when things kind of resolved that way, part of what happened was that earlier sources that had written against the use of images were destroyed. So historical accounts, theological accounts, things like that. Really the only evidence we have from the iconoclasts, those who were against images themselves, is actually when you're reading the work of people who are arguing for the use of images, and then they're quoting from those who are against in order to refute them. So for example, I told you that there were 2 councils, Council of Hira, which was against images, and then the Council of Nicaea, which was for them. The only reason we have records from the Council of Hira is because the Council of Nicaea quotes the conclusions of that earlier council in order to reject them. What that means as a historian is that when you're going back through the history, you're not only having to kind of untangle the complexities of the story and the political and religious elements and all of that kind of stuff, but you're also dealing with a heavy lack of evidence from one side. You're very much getting one side of the story, and the histories that we have from that time are often significantly later. So if you're you're reading events, you're reading books that were written in the 8 or 900s about events that were taking place in the 700s. And so even the first-hand accounts are not really very first-hand, and they're very much decidedly, openly pro-image. And so there's all sorts of fantastic things you find in the sources, and there's a real challenge in trying to sort through what actually happened. It's not just a debate over the interpretation of facts, there's a debate over the facts of all of this itself. That's part of where Philip Jenkins' book comes into play. Sorry, that was a long intro, but I told you this is a complex subject. So Philip Jenkins is writing as a historian, as an academic, and he's trying to pull together not only what we have from these sources, but also how contemporary historians have tried to go back and dig deeper into the narrative. Again, if you were to go into an Eastern Orthodox church, if I can speak with all respect here, you would most likely get a kind of popular level version of this event that says, the church had always used icons and images. Veneration was something that went all the way back to the apostles, and then in the 700s, these heretics rose up within the church and tried to overturn this long-standing practice and introduce this radical new iconoclastic vision. But they were beaten back and defeated, and the heretics were condemned, and the church reaffirmed and embraced its belief in the use of images and the veneration of icons, and it's absolutely central to the faith. That's kind of the version that you get. And a lot of church histories that even talk about this are coming from that vantage point and giving you that story. The challenge is, number one, that glosses over the historiographical complexities that I just mentioned. And it doesn't do justice to what we actually do know from the history. And so there's been a movement where, historically, oftentimes that was the story that was told. But there's been a movement in recent decades to dig back into those sources, to interact with them critically, to try and weigh, can we trust what this is saying about this or not? How might their biases impact it, that kind of thing. Looking at other archaeological evidence, looking at other literary evidence, just trying to kind of interact as impartially as possible on this. And there's been some tremendous work done on this subject by Protestant scholars, Roman Catholic scholars, Eastern Orthodox scholars. So it's a broad ecumenical thing. This is not just a partisan thing, but there's been a lot of work done on that. And the scholarship has found that the kind of traditional story does not fairly reflect the complexity that's there. And so Jenkins is writing as, I would say, one conversation partner in that broader discussion. However, he's also writing, and he goes over this in the beginning of the book. He kind of, in the first chapter, goes over some of the things I've talked about, the historiographical complexities, the trends of scholarship, things like that. And he's appreciative of critical scholarship. He's going to interact with it extensively. However, he wants to push back a little bit, and he sort of says, I think the pendulum has swung too far, and that there is a sound basis for the use of images and the history of images and things like that we'll talk about in a minute. And so he's kind of coming as part of that conversation, but also wanting to say, hey, I think there's more weight to the pro-image narrative than has been acknowledged in recent conversations and scholarship. So that's very much his position. I'll just put my cards on the table and say that, theologically, right, as an Orthodox Presbyterian minister, our confessional documents forbid the use of images of Christ in particular. We're not against the use of all images or art, not at all. We're not even against portraying biblical characters or scenes, from the Old Testament or the apostles or things like that. But we do believe, for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into all of here, that attempting to depict the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit, including Jesus as our incarnate Lord, is something that we are forbidden to do and incapable of doing. And that if we do try to do that, that leads to superstition and idolatry and false worship. So that's my theological concern. So that's one kind of stance. The other piece, though, historically, is that I don't think the traditional narrative that these iconoclasts sprang up out of nowhere and then the church rebuked them at all reflects the history that we actually have. And Jenkins tries to kind of push back on the pro-image side, and I don't find his pushbacks very convincing for some reasons that I'll get into. So let me get into some of that now. Sorry, there's so much tied up in this debate, so much going on in this book, and so much swirling through my muddled mind. So let me try to pull out what would actually be helpful here. Thanks for bearing with me. One of the big questions, of course, when you hear about this big debate that kind of envelops the Eastern Church is, you know, where did all this come from? Because one of the things that both sides want to argue for is that the other side is introducing a novelty to the church. So we live in a day and age, especially if you're in America, where being new, being novel, like that's what you want to be. That's what you're supposed to be. That's an argument in favor. Hey, we're not doing this old thing. We're doing something new. In the ancient world, the values were flipped. So if you say, this is not an old thing, we're doing something new, people are going to be suspicious of that. That's a mark against it, not a mark for it. If I say, this is something that has always been done, that's not an invitation to change, which is how an American might hear that in our context. It is rather a motivation not to change, to say, okay, good. That's what we're trying to do, to find the historic position. And that's kind of true culturally in general, but especially in terms of theology in the church, that is very important. And part of that is because Christianity is a religion about continuity. That we're not introducing novel things. We are holding fast to what has been handed down to us in the scriptures and in the history of the church. And that had become a very important idea, especially in the East. And so, as the iconoclasts are arguing against images, or the iconophiles or iconodules are arguing for images, both of them are saying, hey, we have the historic position, you're introducing something new. So for us as contemporary historians, you step back from that and you say, okay, so let's weigh those claims. And as we do that, there's a very solid, broad scholarly consensus that has emerged around this question. And the scholarly consensus is this, that the use of images is something that develops in the history of the church. It's not there from the beginning. And that especially the veneration of images and icons is something that develops later in the history, in fact, quite late in the history, and was not present at the beginning. So the use of images itself is a little harder to pin down, and we have to all admit, we don't have extensive records from the first and second, and third century. Once Christianity kind of comes out into the open, there's more that's available, but there's still a lot more that we wish we had. So every historian would acknowledge that. However, you don't really see the use of images in those first 2 or 3 centuries. And when you do see images mentioned, it's by Christians who are saying, this is a point of contrast between us, the church, and the world, that they use images, they worship through images, and we don't. Or occasionally you'll have, for example, there's a very famous letter from Epiphanius, who goes into a church and sees that they're using images, and he rips it down, right, and wants to destroy the image and says, this is not what we do as Christians, right? This should not be happening. So the few mentions you get of images demonstrate that, at a broad level at least, the church was not using images. If you walked into a church in those first few centuries, you would not have been confronted with icons and images and pictures and all these kinds of things. That was not part of the practice of the early church. And then when you go the step beyond that to talk about not just making an image, but venerating it, using it in worship, kissing it, bowing down to it, praying to the saint or to Christ through the image, all of those kinds of things, which become very important in this struggle over the icons and become very important for later churches who continue the practice of icons. That does not happen until very late in the history. Now, the scholarly kind of debate at this stage is really, is that something that occurs in the 6th century, or does it occur in the 7th century? Jenkins, he argues for an earlier date. And part of what was frustrating me about this is he sort of says, oh, this is a very old practice. It goes back, when the iconoclastic controversy popped up in the 720s and 30s. This has been going on for a long time. That's true in one sense, but he wants to argue, I think the earliest he's able to push the date back is like 580. So, yeah, that's there's some time between that and the iconoclastic controversy, but there's not that much time, right? And that still means you've got 500 to 600 years, right? Half a millennium where the church is not using images in this way. So I feel like he underweighs the fact that when we look at the history, and this is true of Roman Catholic scholars, I think Richard Price is a Roman Catholic priest who has done a lot of work on this, and he's argued very strongly, and others as well, I think he argues for a later date. This is like 7th century, so it's really the 600s. But even if you go for an early date like Jenkins does, it's still not that early. You still have a huge chunk of history where images are not being used, and are certainly not being used for veneration and for worship. So there is a development that takes place. But when we come to the iconoclastic controversy that this book is detailing, you are dealing with something that is in some ways pretty new to the history of the church, and is contested, which is why the controversy comes about in the first place. It wasn't like Leo just woke up and said, you know what, I think I want to throw out this ancient practice of the church. No, he's seeing, and others are seeing, that this practice is growing and creeping into the church, and he's against it. And so he launches his campaign against the images, and that sparks this big struggle. Really what's different, I would suggest, in the iconoclastic controversy is that it rises to the level of imperial concern. And that's the story that's being played out. So, anyways, Jenkins is kind of planting his flag with the pro-image side, and that comes out a number of places when he's kind of interacting with arguments for or against images, how he leans in terms of the dating of certain things, all of that. He has a chapter at the end of the book called Iconoclasms, where he tries to tie the concerns of iconoclast in the 8th and 9th centuries to the broader impulse of iconoclasm, and he's thinking there about like secular people who are rejecting political rulers, toppling statues of Lenin or something, or in our contemporary debates, people who are arguing that we should take down statues of Confederate soldiers, all that kind of thing. So he's wanting to kind of broaden this scope out and connect dots that, frankly, I don't think are there. I don't think that's a fair thing at all, to say that the concerns motivating certain church fathers about the use of images in the early church is at all the same as people who are wanting to see statues of figures from history or political figures they disagree with being removed or overthrown. What is happening might look similar, but the why is very, very different. So I think Jenkins makes some leaps there and doesn't really demonstrate. And as someone who not only has a different view of the historical scholarship, but has a different view theologically than Jenkins, I found that it seemed like he was very quick to give weight to the pro-image side and didn't really seem to understand fully those who have concerns about images. And so I felt like there was a weakness there, and there was kind of a dismissiveness of one side, and then kind of a leniency given to the other, which was unfortunate, because in much of the book, what Jenkins is trying to do is to kind of impartially, dig through the history and reconstruct a narrative that does match something that is reliable. And to be 100% fair, I think he does a good job of that overall. So the kind of flow of the book, as I said in the first chapter, he's kind of introducing this whole discussion and debate, some of the scholarship and things like that. He has a second chapter where he's really trying to kind of lay out what I was summarizing at the beginning, the kind of political and historical context. What's the difference between the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, East and West, all of those kinds of things, and the role of emperors and that kind of thing. And then he begins to tell the story of the iconoclastic controversy. And he begins in chapter 3 with Leo's revolution, which is really telling the story of how this begins. Again, you can hear in that Leo's revolution assumes that the Emperor Leo is revolting against a historic practice, which is itself a kind of biased reading of the history. I would suggest the revolution was the promotion and veneration of icons, and Leo is a traditionalist who's kind of wanting to take the church back to what it had been. But anyways, that's somewhat to the side. He has a chapter called Abraham's Children, where he's trying to show how the presence of Judaism and Islam impacted this debate, both in the question of, was there cross-pollination between these different religions in terms of the use of images? And then how did the prospect of Islamic conquest, which of course is very present in Constantinople and the Eastern Empire at this time, how does that impact the weight that's given to all of these things as well? Then he has two very important chapters which are more historical theology. So he has a chapter called Against Images, where he tries to lay out what was the theological argument against the use of images, and I think he does a fair job of trying to capture that, although he doesn't find it convincing, quite obviously. And then chapter 6, Images of Truth, where he's kind of doing the same for the other side, trying to flesh out what they believe, which of course is an easier task to do because we have their writings in their own words. The others we only kind of have refracted through the lens of their opponents, so that distorts the story in some ways. And then he has 3 more chapters where he's kind of just walking through the back and forth of the story. Constantine's battles, Irene's revolution, the second iconoclasm. He's just kind of going through how did all this play out in the Eastern Empire and that kind of thing. That is very well done. I don't think there's a lot that would be disagreed with there. There's a lot you can learn from those parts. And then he has a chapter called Legacies East and West, where he tries to kind of trace out what's the importance of this, because this can sound like, and perhaps you heard me read the title and thought, wow, that sounds like a really niche thing. And in some ways, it is, but in many ways it's not. Especially as you interact, if you're a Protestant interacting with other church traditions like Eastern Orthodoxy, this is going to come up a lot, right? And you've got to be aware of the history and the theology in order to engage in that productively. And again, I would suggest, even kind of beyond what Jenkins would, that there was a very strong practice and consensus in the church, and this controversy helped move the church to a very different position, which has become very common. But there's a question there for us to wrestle with: are we representing well the history of our church in its earliest centuries, and are we wrestling with the biblical and theological concerns that led them to that practice? So that's another video in its own right, but that's something that I think does kind of echo down in terms of a legacy. And then the chapter I already mentioned on iconoclasms, which I did not find overly convincing or helpful. So as you can see, he's covering a lot of ground, and he's dealing with something that is a difficult story. It's complex, and you have to really spend some time sorting through the facts and figuring out what are the facts, and then you have to interpret those facts. As you can probably tell from this video, I did not agree with all of his interpretation of the facts. However, I think he does a good job of kind of getting the facts on the table, laying those things out, and he is trying to be impartial and scholarly in his interaction with these things. I don't think he always succeeds, but he often does. So if you are interested in church history, and this is an academic book, I would suggest this as probably more of a specialist kind of thing. I think others are going to find it difficult and maybe less helpful, but if you are interested in these things, this is an important part of the conversation. It's a recent book, 2023, so he's pulling together and trying to interact with the scholarship that's happened. I don't think anything that he said should really change the direction of scholarship. I think the work of Richard Price and others stands in spite of Jenkins' work, but if you want to keep abreast of the conversation, this is something that would be important to read as part of that. And there's a lot to learn from this chapter in church history. So a lot more I could say. I know I've been talking for 30 minutes here, so this is a long review for me. But lots more I could say. But those are some thoughts on Philip Jenkins' book, A Storm of Empire.